Hey everyone, this is your OG, Original Gamer, and this is another Fateless Podcast Speed Recap. This week we have Chosen, Dirk, Broken Not Dead, and Mr. Sneaky talking about what Fateless can bring to the game development industry that other game development companies cannot, and what lessons learned they're using to show them what not to do. We will discuss many of the pain points that Fateless is taking forward into Godforge so it does not find itself in the position of so many other games, where strategic and financial decisions ruin and undermine the fun in the game. So, without further ado, let's optimize.
Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Fateless Podcast episode, and joining me from the Fateless...
All right, so Chosen and is there, Brad, Dirk, Broken But Not Dead, and Mr. Sneaky. So, Broken But Not Dead and Mr. Sneaky are both content creators from our community. Great folks. Mr. Sneaky's been on once before. This is the first time for Broken Not Dead. So, they get into their intros. Broken Not Dead, Godforge Edition, he says, is his channel. He has over 40 years of gaming, started with Atari's Pac-Man, just like your OG, started with Atari too. We were laughing in the Discord, messaging back and forth about what Atari games, and then he went over to Dungeon Crawlers on PC. He had an NES. I told him I got a Sega Genesis, so we were laughing about different games we liked. Then he got into MMO with Ultima Online, okay? This was the first really recognized MMO back in 1997. So he talked about that. He's got great experience from like the beginning of this sort of MMO start. He said he also played Star Wars Galaxy, and he'll tie that into a shout out. He gives Aaron later, which Aaron also worked on that IP. But that he's super excited for Godforge. Mr. Sneaky, we've had him on the channel before. He said he felt young. He was born in 94, so welcome to your 30s, Mr. Sneaky. He covers mobile city building games like Age of Empires Mobile is what he covers at the moment. But he's certainly waiting, like he said, for next month and Godforge. He talks a little bit about, what not to do right off the bat. It bleeds right into that with monetization policies. He says feel predatory, but unfortunately he enjoys the game, so it's kind of a give or take. All right. Then we get into Godforge game design updates, and Dirk says, they've been burning the midnight oil to have everything ready for alpha, but he's really excited because he can put it on auto, he can set it up, and it looks slick. It's running, and it's enjoying to watch. It's satisfying to watch. So that tells us we're definitely getting really close if that's where their playtesting is. All right, so then Chosen talks a little bit about where Fateless lies between an indie and a AAA studio and what they can do that other studios aren't doing in terms of transparency. So Broken asks, what is Fateless able to do that other studios cannot? Or, they're just established, or this is not the way they do things. So Chosen mentions, how much the community focus allows for transparency, where bigger studios have this greater separation. You just can't reach them. You don't talk to their CEO. Dirk mentions how, like, in those kind of things, leaks are marketing, like they're intentional, where, like he said, for us, leaks aren't usually planned. They kind of come out organically. They're just shown or something like that. So he says it lets them take risks and try new things, and they've even created a really innovative tool in Unity. Didn't go into it too much, but he says it could be its own product just in itself that helps them bring heroes into the game. So that's really cool, sort of a behind-the-scenes leak in that regard in terms of the efficiency that Fateless will have to bring out new characters in that pipeline. Then Broken also mentions how Aaron worked on Ultima, which he loves, and Star Wars Galaxies, which he loves, so he gave a shout out to Aaron as well. Then Dirk goes on, he mentions the balance strategy going forward, that they want to build up characters rather than nerf. That's sort of the nerf philosophy they have. And Chosen mentions, when nerfs happen, it undoes work gamers have done. So, there could be nerfs in the early stages if something is just flat out broken, he said, but don't expect things to be static and fixed. They want this good feedback with them during this time and get that conversation flowing. So that is great. That builds a lot of confidence between the gamers and the game developers. They talk about small changes versus big changes. And Chosen kind of asks, like, what would you prefer to see? Like large, meaningful content updates updates or very frequent, updates that might handle change, quality of life and things like that. Chosen said, he's like more prefers to play stuff safe with a kit, not make it too powerful. And he said Dirk's on the other end of the spectrum. He wants a 12 times multiplier, and thing to be crazy. And Dirk says, well, if someone comes out and looks amazing, I just want the experience of playing with them to match what their look is. So they're like a little trapped in that they made him look so great that he just wants it to, align with that ability and how it looks and how it feels, that experience of using that champion. So somewhere between those two is probably where Paul finds the right point, they said. And then Dirk says he wants that look, like I said, to match the ability to make sense. And so he said less often changes that are more impactful, or should we go with frequent changes that are minor? Like I said, from my perspective, I think what the question is as a project manager is whether or not to go with an agile methodology or a waterfall style methodology, which is almost like quarterly releases. I think that your agile methodology gives you more flexibility in order to pivot mid-planning or even mid-design and being able to, without having to go all the way back to the beginning, where waterfall, you just either follow it all the way through and push it out, or if it becomes obsolete or irrelevant in the process, then you just kill it. Obviously, what I would say is the best strategy is probably something similar to what I saw at Cisco, is a hybrid of waterfall and agile. So big drops of info that make the game feel like it's evolving with noticeable changes, and then having some level of frequency of updates to give those small changes where those are like your fine tuning mechanisms as a dev team. So that would just be my thoughts on it. But, I'm sure that Fateless will figure out that. They were just discussing it, and I thought I'd throw in my 2 cents for free. They go on to talk about massive meta changes, and Dirk, I think, makes a great point here about how, too many games just don't give the meta change enough time to organically take hold, because it can be up to a year later before that change is really spread through the gaming community or population because of how long it might take to get that new thing or whatever. And so he says he's seen a lot of games kind of rush to put out the next thing before the last meta shift has even really settled in. I thought that was a good point of understanding it from a gamer's perspective. They mentioned putting out nerfs, and I would say maybe, or they mentioned putting out nerfs, but also having some content release with it, so it kind of dulls the pain of the nerf. Okay, it's getting nerfed, but I got new content, so I'm excited about that. So it's a little bit of a consolation for every pain, like a one for one. If you got to put out something that is going to be a pain point for the community, then try to put out something that lifts or is a benefit in the equal amount or something like that. Dirk mentions that speed to release is a little stressful for them, and getting some of the parts of the team used to having to have it on a very rigid fixed schedule is tough. They're still probably getting to a place where their schedules feel more fixed naturally. That's just, it's probably just the amount of improvement they've been going through. They're shortening their cycles and moving things through their process quicker and quicker. So the process is evolving about as fast as they're using it. And that's great. That's just the nature of being a growing company about to launch. So, really interesting stuff. We get a lot of kind of behind the scenes type of information from them about, what's stressful, what's exciting, what, what is cool. Obviously, as they launch, we assume there'll be a war room that would cover or handle that triage of, or triaging that flood of info that'll be headed their way once all of the gamers start alpha testing. But Simon has mentioned that they've been plussing up the team to be able to accommodate for that. All right. They then get into evolving meta and seasonal modes. Dirk is pushing for balancing to be built into the game modes versus pushed in patches. So, there'll be nerfs or buffs that are specific to a season, but they're not permanent. So you could go to the Gates of Heaven or the Pits of Hell, and certain champions will be stronger or weaker for that seasonal event. That's pretty cool. He also mentions wanting serious PvP mode where meta can be have a year to settle in before that next big change comes. We talked about that. And I would say that I think the time difference that's hard to manage here is the time from when the first whales or power creepers obtain the meta and are using it to the second timeline, which is when the average gamer or the free-to-play gamer obtains the meta and have built it to be able to actually use it. And I think this is the timeline that we feel bumped up against with that next meta release, is that the whales are pushing the pace, and it's the average gamer who feels bumped up against by the next one. So how do you appeal to the top 1% and the middle 50% at the same time? And that, I think, is the challenge, that if Fateless can solve this in a really clever way, will equal serious longevity for the game. I'm talking like 10 plus years kind of thing. And I don't even need to tell you how much profit that will bring for Fateless, but I think this is the balance I see as the most pivotal for sustained success as a gaming studio. How do they manage those timelines so that excited players' progression isn't stepped all over by spenders? I think this requires high levels of discipline. Fateless will need to stay true to its ideals despite pressure internally and externally to maximize revenues. I think this discipline needs to come from a position of posture, meaning Fateless knows the value of what they built and know that gamers do not leave a good game just because you enforce rules or limit power creep. It can be hard to hold that belief before there's proof, but what I heard in Dirk's comment is that the game has reached a point that it is a confidence builder and they're ready to show it off. So this is what transparency looks like. It shows us Fateless's intentions as they design, test, and launch the game. This is the future of game development in EuroG's opinion. But only Fateless has the courage so far to stay the course, where other game studios hide behind layers of pretty but inauthentic interactions with their community. Okay? We went a little long there. We'll catch up. Music and storytelling. Broken asks, hey, the foundation of this game, there's really a ton of detail. The music's awesome. The lore and the story has so much put into it. When did you decide this was all worth focusing on? Dirk said him and Sham have always been about the music, and it's just something they love, and they think it adds a ton to the game experience. So he said they don't really want to skip on those details that they find important and they like. Broken says that the music in most games today just isn't that good. That's why people don't listen to it. And Dirk mentions like Final Fantasy as sort of a gold standard and says, their music was great and you knew every area of the game and every piece of music that was tied to it. So he said story delivery can be tough because people do skip through them, but he said the Godforge cutscenes are so on point that he thinks they work to help add to the experience and they're not just filler. Chosen also says the story is crucial for longevity in his opinion. The music is recognizable as Godforge long-term is his goal. Okay, then they talk about building myth-inspired IP. Dirk says that when they decided to create their own OP, it was fun because they could determine Fateless's version of all these myths. They had some clay to work with, but it was up to them as to how to see it. They move on to ethical monetization. Mr. Sneaky asks, monetization is needed. We got to pay for this game, but what is the approach like you guys have in terms of like the spending? So Dirk says, every game like this has RNG, has that element to it. It's a gotcha game. He said some things need to be hard to get because it feels good then when you get them. He said in this game, rares are really good. Commons and uncommons don't look cheap while you use them. So value is pushed all the way down. So they're fighting power creep from step one, as we've pointed out before. Dirk gives a great example. He says, I was, working on Sphinx, who is a legendary in the Aru faction. He mentions that Medjay, who's a common or uncommon, that the Sandstorm effect looked even better than some of Sphinx's effect. And that's the piece. They said, well, that's the level of value they're pushing down. He said they'll still need to balance this because they don't want anybody to be confused as to like what are the most powerful champs and what aren't. But he said all the champs, rare and up, all have all abilities. He said, obviously the uncommons and commons have sort of like a piece of the sets. They don't have a full-blown set. And he said some of that might get dialed back, not to confuse new players, but Dirk is the Midnight Ninja buffer, I guess. He's secretly pumping up some of these champions kits at night when no one's looking. Chosen mentions, they have to, the work that they got to put in, make sure that all their lower rarity kits and heroes are just as valuable and just as good. So then they get in what not to do. They want to avoid any spend-only gates where the only way to get through it is to spend a ton of money. They talk about raids pop-ups and every 3 seconds being just Sneaky calls it a flashbang. Chosen asks if it's done anything for the game. He just clicks them right off. Then Dirk talks about how devs should play their own games, which is a great call out because that's the only way they can truly understand these things. Chosen mentions one of his past videos in Raid. It was an April 1st joke video where he joked about being hired by Polarium and tasked with coming up with the most predatory spending practices. And he says, and Dirk agrees, that they know like what they hate, they know what they like, and they're excited now to play this game with others because he feels like some games you ask yourself, did they even play this themselves before putting it out? And Dirk said he's been so busy he hasn't been able to play it a lot, so he's really looking forward to the alpha where he will get to play full bore. And then talks about letting like the meta catch on, and then how they don't play their own game, they look at community feedback, and he says, but that sometimes isn't always accurate. It can be very emotional, like when people lose, they have an emotional response. So you got to take it and understand it in the greater context, which is only something you can do if you're playing your game yourself. You need to have a deep understanding of that game to know where a buff or a nerf is needed. It's a complex ecosystem to balance this game environment. Lastly, they get to the end part here where they say, what is your hero, myth, or legend you'd love to see in the game? Broken Not Dead says 99% of the ones he would choose are in the game, and he's excited for it. Sneaky mentions the Boogeyman. They kind of say, Baba Yaga could be a Slavic version of that in a sense, but just throw around. Dirk mentions Rumpelstiltskin, and he mentions how Baba Yaga had to move from epic to legendary because she just looked too much like a legendary. He talked about how Pandora started as a rare and went up to an epic because just all of her animations looked so cool that they couldn't possibly justify her as a rare. All right, well, this is another Fateless Podcast Speed Recap. We hope you enjoyed our sped up edition. We will leave a link to the full podcast below as well. Thanks for staying with us all the way to the end, and take care of yourself. Remember, play smarter.